Yeah, I know. I know. Another Joshua Wilder video. I know you guys are probably sick of it by now. And this probably will be my last one, hopefully. I don't know. I can't promise that, but I'm getting sick of talking about it too. But it's just hard to just let this one go because it's frustrating. Um, you can blame both sides if you want. And you can blame Wilder's side, but when you do blame Wilder's side, you can say, well, you don't agree with the thought process or the decision making. If you believed that Deontay Wilder should have taken the 12 and a half right off the jump because you thought that that's what he was worth, then you can take that stance. If you thought that he should have taken the 15 million because that's what you thought he was worth, then you can take that stance. If you question, why did Team Wilder cancel that Friday meeting when Eddie Hearn was in New York, you can criticize that. If you ask yourself why did they need to wait till Friday to send the contract back with the questions instead of Wednesday when they received the contract on Monday, you can criticize and question that too. Well, one thing you can't say is they haven't been consistent with what they've been saying. They haven't really misled us. They haven't contradicted themselves pretty much at all. But when you look at Team Joshua and Eddie Hearn, the problem most of us have is the lies. And I hate to use that word lie. It's a strong word, but they just flat out lie and they've contradicted themselves. They've made false statements that just aren't true. And people take those statements and they run with them, and they have run with them. Again, forgive me for being redundant. I'm going to bring up a couple of things that have already been brought up by other people, but just stay with me and follow along because there's a method to my madness. I was going back and forth with Eddie Hearn on Twitter yesterday about how they filed for the exception with the IBF in regards to Kubrat Pulev being the mandatory, and he responded to me, well, the reason why we filed and we were granted that exception was because we had signed contracts. I put a link in the description box to the ruling on how to apply for an exception. And there is nothing in that rule that states that you have to have signed contracts in hand before you file an exception. And Eddie Hearn was on that IFL TV video yesterday, that interview with Kugan Cassius. Shout out to Kugan Cassius. Always doing what he needs to do, man. He's on the grind. Props to him. But in regards to this situation, there's nothing in the rules that states that. And also, he complained about how the WBA was on his back and they were pressing him and they were pressing him. And they weren't happy with how long the process was taking. But when he filed for the exception with the IBF and was granted that, he was allowed until December 2nd to make that fight with Pulev. And keep in mind, the Klitschko fight was in April. So do the math. That's pretty much 8 months away. So that he was given an 8-month deadline after the exception was filed and approved for the fight to take place. So if the paperwork is filed and the request is accepted, then it's not like the fight has to happen tomorrow. Okay? So that's that. So that's one thing that's debunked here because, if you look at the rule also, what's required to file an exception of any rule, not just mandatory defenses, any rule that is in the sanctioning body, what's required is all you have to do is write a letter explaining why you want that exception. So he could have said, we are working diligently towards having this Deontay Wilder fight in September or October or November. That's the deadline. Okay? So we are working diligently in trying to put this fight together. We are confident that this fight will be signed. And if he could show, write that stuff down, show that he's negotiating good faith, then, more often than not, he's going to get that exception. And even, Shelley Finkel said the same thing. He never filed the paperwork, and he admitted he never filed the paperwork because in his mind, he said to himself, well, if they're not going to sign this contract, then I'm not going to file for the exception. But he didn't have, he says that, it was contracted that he had a rematch clause with Klitschko, which he did. But just because you have the rematch clause, you still have to put a second contract together for the rematch regardless. It's not like when you sign for one fight, you have the second contract already drawn up. That usually doesn't happen, okay? So they still had to go through the process of putting a contract together for that rematch. And, it takes time. And, Stephen Espinoza had said, that Deontay Wilder was willing to provide information. His team was willing to provide information that, they could, secure credit for that $50 million. So Eddie Hearn didn't even want it. So the whole thing with the $50 million, I know that's water under the bridge. We shouldn't be talking about it. But for him to say that they didn't provide proof of funds when they were in the process of doing so and he did not want them to, he said, no, it's not needed. That's misleading. So that's another thing. But let's get back to this exception rule. So he never filed for the exception. Never. Okay, and if he did file for the exception, then he would have, had more leeway. Then the WBA could have imposed a deadline because there was no official deadline imposed. Why? Because no paperwork was filed. So Eddie was just, talking to them, all right, supposedly, allegedly, day by day by day. Do you really believe that a sanctioning body is going to talk to a promoter every day? Like, instead of just saying, okay, this is the deadline. If Eddie said, we're really going to make this fight happen. I promise we'll have this signed by such and such date or whatever, or I'm going to try to get this signed by such and such date. And if it was such a sense of urgency, why didn't you just tell Team Wilder, hey, you know what? The WBA says that we need to get this fight done quick. I at least need these contracts back by Wednesday. That was never done. Okay? So the way this was just kind of, a fly-by-night type of negotiations, and, nothing was really done officially, and there was no official deadline set by the WBA because no paperwork was filed. And Eddie Hearn was probably, and again, this is my opinion, probably just saying to them, well, we're trying to get this fight done, but if it doesn't get done, we'll just fight Povetkin anyway. So he's giving the WBA the indication that this is really not a priority to him. You know what I'm saying? So if he really wanted this fight, he was like really trying to convince the WBA that he wanted this fight. He could have been more persuasive to them, a little bit more enthusiastic in how he handled the situation with the WBA. And again, he didn't even file the paperwork. So how serious was he about that? Now let's get back or look at the contracts that were sent. There was supposedly Alexander Povetkin has a contract, okay? And Deontay Wilder was sent a contract. But here's the thing. Deontay Wilder's contract had no date and no venue on it, but Alexander Povetkin's did. Wembley all of a sudden is available in September for Povetkin, but it wasn't available for Deontay Wilder. Originally, Hearn was trying to get the fight for September 15th. but everybody knows that Canelo fights on or around that date anyways. So why is Hearn surprised that it's happening this year? Because it happens every year. Canelo Alvarez fights in September 15th or around that date, the Mexican holiday. He always fights on pay-per-view at that date. All right. And another debunked statement by Hearn is, I'm going to go back to that thing with the having to have fights signed. The WBC granted an exception for Gennady Golovkin and Deontay Wilder, okay? And they did not have contract signed. The Canelo fight was not signed, but the WBC had said, and they've gotten clearance by, they was communicating with Team Golovkin, and they said, and they assured Team Golovkin that if you fight Canelo next, we will not strip you. But if you don't fight Canelo next, we will force you to fight Jamal Charlo. And they also said to Deontay Wilder's team, we will not stand in the way of an Anthony Joshua fight. So that just tells you that, and it just proves evidence that you don't have to have a signed contract in hand in order to get an exception, because Deontay Wilder and Gennady Golovkin got exceptions from the WBC without the fights being signed ahead of time. There's been many times when a champion has just won a title, could have been a grueling fight, and he, right off the bat, first offense, asks for a voluntary. And he may not have one specific fighter in mind. He may have a couple fighters that he may want to fight next, or his team may want to fight next. It's been done several times where they file for an optional and they have a list of opponents. Okay, it's been done several times. For Hearn to say something like that you have to have a signed contract in hand to bring to the sanctioning body in order to file for an exception is totally false, and it's not stated anywhere in the rules. So that's the problem, and the contradiction of Wembley not being available in September when it is available for Povetkin. That's another falsehood, and that's another misleading statement. And having a date and a venue on Povetkin's contract, but not on Wilder's contract. So Wilder signs the contract thinking that it's going to be in October or November, but then Hearn says, hey, he can turn around and say, hey, you know what? I tried to get the venue, blah, 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 and it wasn't available. We're going to have to push this fight back till next year. And you know what? Since it's next year, why don't we just squeeze the Povetkin fight in there while we're waiting, and we'll fight you next. So there was no guarantee that this fight was going to happen next if Deontay Wilder signed that contract. And also the rematch clause. Hearn specifically said, yeah, you know what? We'll fight you in the UK for the first fight, and the second fight can be in the United States. That's great. So then why did the contract say that there's only a rematch clause if Anthony Joshua loses, but not if Deontay Wilder loses? I thought it was, a given that there was going to be two fights regardless of who won or lost. And they're both champions, so they both have the right to ask for rematch clauses. So I thought that was understood, that was put forth. So that's another misleading statement. So everyone's like, oh, yeah, Wilder should just sign the contract. Why is he going to sign a contract if there's a lot of ambiguity on that contract and things aren't made clear? How could you sign a contract with no date and venue and no assurances that you have a rematch clause and no assurances that the fight is going to happen next? He still could have pushed this fight back to next year, and that's what he wanted to do. Why did he have a contract all set for Alexander Povetkin with a date and a venue on it, and the same was not done for Deontay Wilder? I mean, let's be objective. Again, you can criticize Team Wilder for not being expedient, for not being quick with things, for canceling the meeting. But you can't say they said one thing and then went back on what they said. They've been true to their position. They've been moving slowly just as Team Joshua has been moving slowly. Why? Because this is a complicated negotiation. Both sides are posturing very hard. And okay, you want to say Team Joshua is the A side, that's fine. But regardless of that, they're still getting the larger percentage. They're going to be making more money. They're going to be having the fight where they want it. So why can't they at least treat Team Wilder with respect and stop treating them like they're the consolation prize and give them a date and a venue and give them a guaranteed rematch clause? Why couldn't they just do those things? That's the thing. You know, and Shelly Finkel has been around for 40 years. And he's been involved with many fighters, and he's been involved, and he was involved in the biggest heavyweight fight in the history of the sport, Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis. So for Eddie Hearn to sit there and try to lead us to believe that Shelly Finkel is this incompetent simpleton that doesn't know what he's doing, it just doesn't hold water, guys. It just doesn't hold water. I mean, I'm not saying you have to like Shelly Finkel. I'm not saying you have to like Team Wilder. I'm not saying you have to agree with Team Wilder's position, but you have to admit that at least they've been consistent with what they've been saying, whereas Team Joshua has not been. They have contradicted themselves time and time again. So much misinformation has been put out there time and time again. And I've provided evidence time and time again, just as others have time and time again. And each time, Eddie Hearn will try to talk his way out of it. And the problem is, once you tell one lie, you have to tell 3 or 4 or 5 more just to cover up that one that you already told. And he's digging himself a hole. And it's okay if he wanted this fight next year instead of this year. But again, you have to question the logic. Anthony Joshua is definitely going to be favored over Alexander Povetkin. You put a gun to my head, yeah, you could say that Anthony Joshua is supposed to win that fight. But Povetkin has a style that is very problematic. He's arguably in the top 3 or 4 best heavyweights in the world. He can punch. He knows how to box. He's an excellent amateur background, gold medalist. Lost 1 fight to a legend in his prime. A guy that knew how to control range, a guy that had one of the best jabs in heavyweight history, right up there with Larry Holmes and Muhammad Ali in terms of the best jab. He's arguably one of the, the 3 best jabbers in the history of the sport of boxing. He gauges range very well, and he knows how to freeze up the action on the inside and prevent guys from fighting on the inside. Anthony Joshua does not have that same jab. He is not as consistent with it. He has problems controlling range. He's more of a mid-range guy who likes to throw hooks and uppercuts as opposed to fighting on the inside. He gets lazy with his jab. That's why he's been able to be a hit with right hands by numerous opponents. And Joseph Parker landed some solid right hands. You have to ask yourself, if Povetkin lands those same right hands, what's going to happen? And when Povetkin gets inside, Joshua's instincts are not to grab and hold. His instincts are to fight him off him. And if you try to fight Povetkin off you on the inside and go punch for him, he's got the shorter arms. He's the more compact target. He's punching to your body. You have to drop down to get to him. You're at a disadvantage because you're changing your positioning, and you're changing your comfort zone, because on the inside, that's his game. So what do? You take the inside away from him instead of trying to fight him on the inside. That's why that fight with Takam was so sloppy, because he tried to fight Takam on the inside, and it got sloppy. And that's why the Parker fight was difficult for him, because Parker fought him on the outside, and he moved and he stepped to the side after throwing combinations, and he fought him in a tight circle, and he never stayed in the mid-range area of that pocket where Joshua could load up with that hook and that uppercut. So you take the mid-range away from Anthony Joshua, he's got problems. Okay, you can fight him on the outside very well, like Klitschko was doing. He was beating him by fighting him on the outside. Takam was making the fight difficult. He didn't have the physical tools to be successful on the inside like Alexander Povetkin does. Not as big of a puncher as Povetkin, not as active, not as fluid of a combination puncher as Alexander Povetkin is on the inside. Doesn't commit to the body like Alexander Povetkin does. So this is a problematic fight style-wise for Anthony Joshua that he can very well lose. And then this Wilder fight goes out the window. So you have to question, the thought process by Team Joshua and Eddie Hearn. You really do. You have to question it. You really have to question it. I'm being honest. I'm just being honest here. So that's what you have to look at in this situation. Eddie Hearn has given us every indication that he never wanted this fight next. He should have just came out and said it instead of trying to play the public and insult our intelligence. And, you have people like Steven Espinosa, Anthony Joshua. So why would he intentionally lie and criticize Eddie Hearn and prove Eddie Hearn wrong if it wasn't true? You have to ask yourself that. You really do. And Shelly Finkel, the fighters he's managed, Pernell Whitaker, Vanna Holyfield, Mike Tyson, Julio Cesar Chavez, Vladimir Klitschko. I mean, this guy's been manager and he's been involved with the best fighters in the world. He's been around since 1980. And all of a sudden, he doesn't know what he's doing, and Eddie Hearn does. Eddie Hearn's never been involved in a fight that has grossed $100 million before. The biggest fight that Eddie Hearn's been involved in is a $53 million fight. Shelly Finkel's been involved in numerous fights that have grossed, $100 million. Okay, so I mean, this guy, it's not his first rodeo. And again, I'm not saying that Team Wilder has been perfect throughout these negotiations, but they've been consistent. For the most part, they've been honest, and they have not wavered from their position. Team Joshua's all over the place. So again, it's probably going to be the last video, but I just had to come out with, all this stuff because Eddie Hearn is not being honest. He could have filed for the exception months ago. And then after filing that, a deadline would have been imposed. Why would a deadline be imposed if there's no paperwork filed? You saw, and I've already put links in my other videos of how the IBF put a deadline in place once the exception was granted. And they gave him till December 2nd. They gave him several months to put that fight together. I mean, this is nothing new. You don't just snap your fingers and these fights get put together like that. They wanted the contract back on Wednesday. They were going to get back on Friday. So you complained about waiting so long. So you waited so long, Eddie, but you couldn't wait 2 days more? Or you couldn't have at least said, hey, you know what? I can't wait till Friday. Is there a way you can get that back to me on Wednesday? See what I'm saying? And then you're going to initially schedule a fight for on a date where you already know the biggest star in the sport is fighting on pay-per-view. And he's fighting against Gennady Golovkin. A fight that's going to do over $100 million. It's going to probably do 1.5, 1.6 pay-per-view buys. And you're going to even entertain the thought that, you know, you're going to put a fight on that date. And then you're going to turn around and say, well, we didn't know if the fight was going to happen. Yeah, okay, you didn't know if the fight was going to happen. But, I mean, it wasn't confirmed yet that the fight wasn't going to happen. So if you're so, you know, concerned and you're so well thought out in your planning, why would you schedule a fight until you knew for sure that Canelo fight with Golovkin wasn't going to happen? Why would you go ahead and you said, oh, we can't, you know, going by your logic, oh, we can't just request an exception for a fight that's not signed yet. So why would you make a decision based off a fight that was not officially scrapped yet? You see the inconsistencies here, guys, and the contradictions here. You have to look at that. And that's the problem. I mean, I can go on for days, and I don't want to just keep repeating myself and sound redundant, but you guys can figure it out yourselves. You know, you can take your sides. I know the sport is tribal, but remember, one side is not telling the truth. One side is contradicting themselves. Whereas the other side, you may not like how they're doing business, but at least they're upfront with you on how they're doing business. They're not telling you anything new. Like, you could sit there and say, yeah, you know, this is all that Wilder's worth. You should have taken that money. Oh, you know what? They should have had that meeting on Friday. You know what? That contract should have been back by Friday. You can say all those things, and I will not refute any of them. I will say, you know what? Point well taken. Point well taken. But again, you can criticize the process, but you can't criticize the motive. That's the thing. That's what they wanted to do. Whereas Eddie's leading you believe that, you know, he wants to do one thing, but then tomorrow he's telling you he wants to do another. Okay? You don't, if you really want to fight, you don't offer another fighter a contract. You can sit there and see, you could say, you know, you're the backup plan. You can write a contract out and say, you know what, you are the backup plan if the Wilder fight doesn't fall through. You can have a provisionary contract, just like Triple G had with Billy Joe Saunders. And it was understood, and that's why Frank Warren never came back and was complaining, or Billy Joe Saunders never came back and complained, because it was understood that the only way that this fight happens is if we can't make the Canelo fight. And the same, see, this is what you have to do, Eddie. Take notes. Look at how it's really done. Okay, I don't like Oscar De La Hoya. I mean, I'm not crazy about him. But Eric Gomez is pretty much running the show over there, and he knows what's going on too. And he figured it out, and he made it happen. So look at how that situation was handled. And moving forward, apply that type of promoting to how you're going to handle this fight. Okay, so look at that and take notes in terms of negotiating from that side and how that fight got done. Because two sides really wanted it. And they pressed, and they got it done. You did not press hard for this fight. Because again, in your mind, you said, you know what? It doesn't have to happen next. It can happen next year. But again, it's not smart because you got a tough fight with Povetkin. You're rolling the dice here. It's not etched in stone that you got that victory. It's not an easy fight. And you're going to look, with all due respect, like the biggest idiot in the world if Joshua loses. And even if he doesn't lose, what if he's in a tough fight and he gets busted up and he leaves some of himself in the ring that night? So then when he does go into a fight with Deontay Wilder, he may not be that same Joshua that he was before that September fight. Why risk that? Why put him in a fight that could potentially be a war and then put him in another tough fight back to back? Why would you put again, you criticize everybody's, you know, managerial skills and their business logic. Think about this, guys. Why would you put a fighter in two tough back-to-back fights in a row? Why? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And then you can sit there and say, well, they did it with Wilder. Ortiz was a tough fight. That's fine. But again, you know, the perception was that going in, Wilder's team, I believe, thought that they were going to knock out Ortiz in about 5 or 6 rounds, and it didn't happen. But everybody knows that you're not going to blow Alexander Povetkin out. Everybody knows, well, most people know who understand the sport, that this is not an easy fight. Okay, so you're going to put your fighter in back-to-back tough fights, and the fight after this is supposed to be the toughest fight of his career. So you're going to put him in there with, in 2 wars, 2 potential wars back-to-back. That's not smart. It's just not smart. At least if you put him in there with Wilder first, you're going to get compensated. It's going to be, the risk for reward is going to be more beneficial and more in your favor than if you just put him in there with Povetkin straight away. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of Joshua fanboys in this comment section blasting me, attacking me. I know it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And you guys have a great day. Take care. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.